Cleveland, Ohio. This is the All Access Med School Admissions Podcast. Hello again, everybody. I'm your host, Christian Essman, and I'm the Senior Director of Admissions and Financial Aid here at the medical school, and bringing you a special episode this time to talk about virtual interview tips and advice. We're now beginning the virtual interview process and season at the time I'm recording this, and so we wanted to bring you some special tips and things to consider when you have an interview coming up. So this is a kind of a two-parter. It begins with Dr. Mehta and I having a conversation about looking back at last year and reflecting on the things we learned and how we got to this point in a way, and then some tips from our perspective. And then after that conversation, I have some tips from current medical students who went through the whole process last year, sharing with you some of their advice from the previous applicant perspective. So stick around after my conversation with Dr. Mehta to hear tips from current medical students. All right, check it out. Hope you enjoy it. All right, so hi.
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Good. So, my intros I always have a hard time with.
I mean, especially since our offices are like 10 feet away from each other. So
we talked for an hour already.
Just an hour before our day started.
So interview season is upon us, and we were talking about virtual interviews, and I said, let's record this so that we can, get some tips and reflect back on what we went through the last year and hopefully help some people out.
It's very timely. There's no doubt.
So I wanted to take a couple minutes and just reflect on where we were a year ago.
You mean when our hair was on fire?
That's right. When our hair was on fire. And I gave a TED-esque talk back in the spring to that regional group of pre-health advisors.
Yeah, very cool.
And so I'm using that as kind of our outline. But at the time I wrote it, we went through like 4 stages of, I don't know what you would call them. Well,
I mean, there's the stages of grieving. It wasn't quite grieving so much as the stages of abject panic and terror.
Yeah. So the first stage was panic.
Okay.
Then the second stage was adaptation. The third stage, it was new normal. And the third stage, what I called, will we go back?
Yeah.
So remember panic? I
remember panic.
A year ago, we were panic.
We started panicking in like May.
Right.
So yeah. May we were panicking.
And that was tough. I remember sitting, at home, and we were all home and thinking, how are we going to be able to do this?
And even though we were on Zoom together all the time, it wasn't the same as having that proximity. And so the brainstorming felt a little more disconnected. I couldn't just knock on your door and say, hey, what do you think about this?
Yep. It was hard. Yeah. But we were really good. Like you said, let's deconstruct. Let's see this as an opportunity. Let's deconstruct what we're doing for our interview days. It doesn't have to look exactly like it did for the last
it shouldn't look exactly
decades.
Yeah.
So we pulled together.
We did. And in the end, I don't know if you're going to get there if I'm jumping the gun, but in the end, there's so many times in life that we just do the things we do because we've always done it that way. And so it was kind of cool once the panic wore off, and that we could really think about why were we doing what we did? Should we still be doing it? Was it current? Was it actually helpful? And I feel like we've got a much more efficient model of the way we work now.
Yeah.
So opportunity in there.
We'll definitely keep some of those things going forward, but we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. And then came the adaptation part of the stage of our evolution in virtual interviews. But the first week was rocky.
It was very rocky. It could have been worse.
Yeah.
It could have been way worse. But happily, our applicants were very forgiving, as we have tried to be throughout, that, hey, we're all in this together. So it was rocky. It was a little stressful.
Yeah, the first week was rocky. And I think we talked to other people too, and everybody said like their first week was a little dicey from time to time, but it never really, the train never came completely off the tracks. We just had to.
There was just some stuff on the rails.
So then we got pretty good at it.
I like to think we did. It got very easy, sort of melodic, and it was fun. It got really fun.
And it was nice. I remember we getting some validation back from the applicants through like our post-interview day surveys that we were looking at those more closely. And I think we had in the past more frequently. And it was reassuring, like, okay, I think we're doing okay.
We're going in the right direction here.
Yep. So when it comes to virtual interviews, we found some advantages and some disadvantages.
Both.
So when it comes to advantages, the big one's financial.
Yes.
I mean,
it's from an equity perspective, or even just from do you really need to have that big of an expenditure when you're already getting ready to embark on a long and expensive journey? If we can get similar information from both sides, which we'll unravel that a little bit more. But if you're applying to 25 medical schools and you're getting 10 interviews and you have to fly to all 10 or drive and take time off from work and pay for a hotel, the expenses really mount. So why not instead go and visit the school once you've been accepted? Maybe out of the 10, you get accepted to 5. Yay, that'd be amazing, or more. And then you, in a really selected way, go and have that expenditure to visit instead of in such an early expository way.
Mm-hmm. We did some focus groups last week with some first years, and we heard that from them loud and clear. Everybody was hands down said, thank you, because it saved me a boatload of money.
And time and stress.
Yeah. The stress part was, and I think that was one that we didn't maybe anticipate, but just we would have come across it eventually, but just for applicants, that stress piece of you going to a new town and an unfamiliar campus and an unfamiliar city early in the morning, trying to find the building.
When the stakes are high, as opposed to when you've already been accepted, where the stakes are different.
Your Uber's late.
Yes.
You're in your suit and you just
your luggage gets lost.
All these things.
You show up in a sweatshirt on interview day, which has happened.
Yep.
Which we're fine with, but the stress of that for the applicant was high.
But then on the other side, I did hear from students, and I think they felt because they could interview in more familiar surroundings at home or in their dorm room.
Yep.
There was that kind of psychological
safety.
Yeah.
Which I think would probably be double-edged though. Like there's that psychological safety, but how do you make sure you amp up your game to move into that professional mindset? And honestly, that's something we all struggled with when we started working from home. How do I stay in my familiar surrounding, but still bring my professional game every day to me sitting in my comfy office?
Yeah. And have a child come in the back through the door, or your dog jump up on you. So everybody kind of had to find that. It was also financially advantageous for admissions offices.
That it was, which was something we hadn't really considered. We didn't have meals and morning breakfast and printing costs and swag, although we like the swag, but we had a little bit of a cost savings on our end too, which was an unanticipated thing.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's not an applicant's issue, but those brochures, the view books and stuff, those are incredibly expensive. And
they're incredibly expensive to print off, and nobody really wants to take them home. Mm-hmm. So has that ship sailed? Has that become sort of an obsolete medium? Yes, I think it has.
Yeah. Okay. But then the advantages, I would say, was the convenience factor. We really saw the convenience factor. For students didn't have to fly to come here, so that was convenient. But on our end, I think we retained more of our interviewers for a longer stretch of time, particularly our clinical
faculty,
because they could
interview from wherever instead of having to go drive in their car from the hospital to the health education campus and conduct an interview and then get back in their car and drive back to the hospital. Mm-hmm. That was so much more time efficient. And if there was a patient they had to see, or if they could always say, not an abject emergency, but if something was pending clinically, you usually have a little bit of wiggle time. Give me 45 minutes, an hour. I had to do this interview and then I'm back with you. So from that perspective, it was very advantageous for our interviewers.
And for the medical students too. Because they were at home as well.
Yep.
So I guess we'll see what that looks like this year, because at least our students are in person right now. So
they're in person, and hopefully they stay in person, but they still have options, right? Our M1s and M2s finish class at noon most days, so they can go home and conduct the interview from there. They don't have to hang around school if they don't want to.
I guess another disadvantage would be we're at the mercy of technology.
We are at the mercy of technology. Indeed, we are.
So most of the times things went very smoothly on our end and the applicants' end, but every once in a while, somebody's connection would drop, or it became a little, you get that your connection is unstable.
Your internet connection's unstable, and I would be like, but on the whole, I feel still though that the potential pitfalls are less than travel. Mm-hmm. Flight gets canceled, can't find an Uber, flight is delayed.
Or trying to make that connection from Terminal 3 to Terminal 4 at O'Hare or something.
That's always a hairy one. So either process has potential pitfalls. I also think one of the benefits really gets back to our having to deconstruct and reconstruct. I feel like the information that we've been providing to our applicants in our new process is really efficient and robust and information that we hope they really need instead of blah, 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 just sort of reshining the curricular information that we've been transmitting year after year. Right. I feel like we're much more mindful and intentional about what we're sharing with our applicants and why.
Yep. But to that point, I missed the personal touch.
Yeah.
We're people.
We are people.
I miss walking into the conference room in the morning.
Feeling the energy of everybody in the room.
Just get a little rah-rah and we're going to have fun today. And this is, we're great. We're happy to have you here and welcome to our city. And so it feels a little, we had to be more emotive. I was more exhausted after the virtual interview days than regular ones.
And that's certainly a known phenomenon with these electronic or virtual media is that you have to emote more. So I guess a tip for the applicants who may be listening is you got to emote a little bit more on Zoom because you can't rely on your body language to show things. Yeah. But yeah, I agree. We were all more tired.
The other thing that we came up with also, it was harder for the applicants to get the vibe of the school.
Oh, yeah.
And it was interesting. I talked to some second year students who went through our in-person interview process, and their take on virtual interviews was like, oh, I'd never want to do that. And
horrible,
if I couldn't visit the school, I don't know if I'd go there. And the first years were like, you know what? It was really worked well, but they did have a hard time picking up the vibe of the institution or the student body and stuff. And so hopefully
there's the trade-off, but that's where, again, I stand by my earlier comment that come and visit after you've been accepted. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're just wasting your money. So I shouldn't even say that because one day we may return to live interviews, but I do think it's just a more efficient method to go and visit the school once you've already been accepted. Now you've winnowed it down to all the potentials.
I remember we were on a virtual meeting with other admissions people, and one thing we were all concerned about is who's going to be interested.
How do we know who's really interested?
Because if you didn't spend all this money to come here, how do we know if you're interested if you're just doing the Zoom interview where it doesn't cost you anything? And so that was one thing we all worried about. But guess what? We all filled our classes. We did. So, and our classes look similar as they have in years past. So I don't know. Certainly, I suppose there's some viable concern about that, but it didn't pan out for us. Mm-hmm. I think we can eliminate that one. So what does it mean going forward then? So the final stages, will we go back? And so this year we're doing virtual, as most U.S. medical schools are doing virtual. A few are doing live, a few are doing sort of a hybrid model, which we won't talk about right now, but we're virtual. Most schools are going virtual. And I know there's a lot of conversation in the admissions community about staying virtual for the reasons we just articulated, that I feel like it's probably higher yield to go and physically go to that city once you've been accepted or you're on the wait list and you know now that school is of high interest to you. Go then, instead of having to go at the very beginning stages where you just don't know what's going to happen. I think what we didn't mention was the equity issues were really exposed last year.
Right. The inequities.
The inequities, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
That because we heard from students saying, I could go to all the interviews that I was invited to, whereas if it was in person, I may have been able to only go to the ones that were nearby. Yeah. Or pick one to travel to that was farther away.
Right. Not to mention the fear of traveling during the pandemic, but that's not hopefully going to be around in years to come as we consider whether to stay virtual or not. There's as Christian very much well summarized, there are benefits, risks and benefits, pros and cons to every decision that is made. But I do know that there's a robust conversation about staying virtual in basically perpetuity.
Yeah. What do you think we're going to do?
Well, my crystal ball seems to be cracked today, but I would like to stay virtual for as long as it's relevant. If everybody starts moving away from the virtual process, then I suppose we'll have to too, because applicant expectations will change. But I really think it's gone well, and I think it will continue to go well.
So it's a few tips. we did interviews 3 days a week last year.
3 days a week.
And so we started seeing some themes, some good things students were doing, and some things we thought maybe applicants could kind of tweak things, but lighting was a big one.
So let me preface this by saying that as an applicant, for applicants, we don't expect high production quality. Right. We don't expect that. Just do what you're doing, do the best you can, but there are ways to optimize the virtual interview. So lighting is one. You don't have to spend money on a light ring or anything like that, although some of them are pretty cheap right now, but have the lighting in front of you, not behind you.
Yeah, like don't be backlit. Big window behind you.
Correct. Then you're shadowed, and it's difficult to see facial expressions when you're shadowed like that. So my window at my home office was to my side, so I had to be mindful. I just took 2 lamps and put them in front, and the lighting was good. But you really want to just maximize the ability to see one another's facial expressions. So lighting is helpful. Camera placement is helpful, eye level or above. If it's too low, we see up your nostrils, which is not, I mean, I'm sure they're fine, but not the ideal way to look for me. As I age, I'm mindful of my chin droop. So having the camera slightly above or at my eyes level is ideal. That said, at my home office, I have a huge monitor and my computer's on top of that. It's a little too high, but what are you going to do? I remember there was an applicant last year whose camera was way up high. We saw the top of his head, basically. Yeah, so it was hard. I mean, I remember the interviewer saying it was hard to connect with him because he was looking at the screen at the interviewer on the screen, but the camera was like 45, 50 degrees. Yeah. And I have a little bit issue with that. So I had to tilt my camera down as well. So that's speaking of where your eyes are. It feels very artificial, but look at the camera and not at the screen. Every once in a while. And that's where sometimes it's so difficult to connect because human instinct is to look at the eyes of the person to whom you're speaking. Mm-hmm. And when you're in a virtual interview, if you're looking at the eyes of the person whom you're speaking, you're not making eye contact at all because the camera's tracking your eyes. So remember to look up at your camera every now and then. That said, we get it. Yeah. We don't expect high production, professional quality here, but just be mindful of that as you move forward with your interviews. A quiet place. Try to find a quiet place as much as possible. Yeah. Go ahead. I mean, if your dog barks in the background or, you know, there's construction outside or your phone rings, we don't know which is the matter. I was interviewing, he's actually a student here now, and he kept apologizing for sirens he goes, I said, I can barely even hear them. He said, he was really worried about it. He's like, I live across the street from a hospital. I'm like, well, it's not your fault. Like, and background noise doesn't, it's not picked up and it doesn't amplify in the way that you think it is. So a lot of times background noise isn't even picked up by the other person. But there was an applicant one day and she's like, can you hear that? And she said, my neighbors are like playing really loud music right now. And I couldn't hear it. So some of this, like now the Zoom technology and the Skype way it filters noise. Yeah, they kind of filter out some background noise. But it can be stress inducing for the person who's actually hearing the noise. So find a quiet space, if only for yourself, so that you can concentrate more. And for that matter, disable notifications on your computer. Yeah. Eliminate other distractions because you do. And by now, everybody listening is probably an expert on virtual interactions for the most part. But a professional interview is still different than logging into a class or something like that. But do try to remove any background distractions that could break your focus, that could sort of make you have to refocus again after you've been pulled away. Yeah. We saw applicants in conference rooms that they reserved for the better part of the day. Classrooms. Once, remember that one applicant was in was in his girlfriend's closet all day. Yes, he was. The one guy was in his basement. And one was his mom was doing virtual school. She was a teacher. So he used her virtual classroom for the day. Yeah. I remember there was one applicant. She was in a wine cellar at her in-laws. That was kind of cool. We thought it was a virtual background. Yeah. Like, that's a really neat virtual background. This is the only place I could find for the day. It had all these big wine. There were some good labels behind it too. I remember noticing that. But when I wrote that down here, I thought though, you have to double check the internet connection in those places. So if you think it's like the best quiet place, your Wi-Fi, it may not be the best connected. And internet connection overall, if you can get on an LAN, if you're hardwired, is going to be way better than Wi-Fi. But so, yeah, you're right, Christian. Once you find that quiet space, you need to you should always demo your technology before the interview anyway, to make sure nothing's changed. Like set up a quick Zoom. You can do a free test my camera with Zoom. Set that up with somebody to see where your camera angle is, your lighting, can they hear you, and how does your Wi-Fi stability seem?
Those are a lot of the do's. Here's a don't. Don't post notes or scripts on your wall or on your computer. I remember hearing some comments from some interviewers that they felt like they could see somebody reading like a paragraph they'd written about something. And that didn't,
it loses authenticity.
Right.
So, I mean, you can have notes in front of you, but have it bullet pointed. We don't expect you to remember everything, but have it bullet pointed in a way that you're not reading a memorized script word for word, just maybe a few memory jogs and speak around it. That gives you much more authenticity.
Yeah. Yep. Because I could see how easy it could be to just start taping
I am
stuff.
interested in Case Western Reserve School of Medicine because of yes.
Let me tell you about my research. Have emergency numbers handy. So frequently, like we give our applicants an emergency phone number. Like if your entire internet goes down and you can't log back in, here's a number to call.
Yeah.
So have that handy first, because if you lose your internet, you may not be able to access the things,
information you need. Excellent point. Yes.
So have those kind of things written down, and then try and not panic.
Don't panic. So my mantra is assume good intentions.
And people heard that.
It's real.
Applicants heard that.
It's real.
Heard that.
And I try. It wasn't my mantra before the pandemic hit, but now it's my mantra for sure, because it's been so stress alleviating to just, no matter what happens, just assume good intentions. If an applicant's Wi-Fi goes out or they drop the call or whatever, it happens. It could happen to us. I got the internet unstable several times last year. And as Christian and I just discussed, our first week was rocky. Mm-hmm. So let's just assume good intentions. Don't panic. We're all here in it together, trying to get through this process. So just assume good intentions. Assume good intentions on the end of the admissions office. We're all working really, really hard to ensure a good experience for the applicant. And we're proud of our product, which is our interview process. Mm-hmm. So we're working really hard. And if something goes awry, you can bet we're panicking and scrambling behind the scenes. So please assume good intentions, as we do as well for our applicants. If something goes awry, we're just going to assume good intentions. We'll figure it out. We're all in it together.
Yep. One of the things that just came to mind too is on these virtual interview days, you have to, I think applicants have to make an extra effort to participate or to engage in discussion with there's like a Q&A, because it's very easy to hide behind the mute button and just stay on mute and let others kind of chime in. And whenever there's that, like, okay, does anybody have any questions? There's the first 10, 15, 20 seconds of everybody just looking at each other. And I think it's just, and it's tough. It can be awkward, but you have to make a little extra effort to be engaged, as we do as well. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to just try and be as comfortable as you can on the camera and talk. We have curated, as I said, we've curated a lot of the content that we give to our applicants. We are doing a flipped classroom type thing. So we've curated a lot of the content to preemptively answer a lot of questions so that we can leave room on Zoom to really talk, to get to know each other. You can get to know us. What do you really want to know? What can we demystify for you? What questions can we answer? What do you want to know more about? What did we not talk about that we should have? Yeah. So to that point, at any interview, you should have done your homework and take notes, like bring questions with you.
If you were going to interview for a job in banking, or if you're going to apply for your attending physician job, you will have done hopefully research about the company or the institution in the city before you show up. You got to be educated before you show up in order to maximize a robust experience.
Yep. So bring those questions. Is there anything else that you can think of?
No, I just have fun with it.
Yeah.
It's different. And as I said, everyone listening is probably well skilled in the art of the virtual process. And maybe you hate it. Maybe you're burned out and you're tired and you're sick of it. But if you can just have a good time, assume good intentions, and just enjoy the process.
Ooh, one more thing I thought of.
Go.
Double check the time zone.
Yes.
Double check the time zone of what time it's going to be in that place.
We had a few applicants last year who miscalculated time zones who wound up showing up late. We get it.
But you could tell they were a little frazzled.
Yes.
Like they thought, I have an hour before that starts. And then they're like, you could see their tie was kind of off to the side. They kind of, I don't know to say they rolled out of bed, but they weren't prepared to start their day when it needed to begin.
Yep.
And so this year in our invitation, I don't know if I told you this, but I put a time zone checker. There's a website.
Oh, you put a link?
Yeah, you can put
hyperlink.
You can put it.
Nicely done. He did not tell me that.
I know.
That's awesome.
But I found it, and so you can put in your time, and it'll tell you, because we had people on interviews in Korea, and Israel, and Germany, and in England.
I guess that's one of the benefits of the virtual interview season too. You can do other things during your interview year.
But some people, like particularly those that were in Asia, they were up all night.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something to be mindful of. It's very convenient that you can still do your interview day, but you may have to sacrifice your bedtime.
Yes.
To stay up, throughout the evening or overnight.
So plan ahead for a couple of days to figure out what you'll need to have in play so that you can be functional and awake.
Yeah. I remember one applicant was a teacher, and she was staying up all night and had to go to teach school English the next morning. Yeah. So there's going to be some of those sacrifices too from time to time.
But it's still less of a sacrifice than having to hop on a plane and fly internationally for interviews and maybe not be able to group them. So and it's just different. It's
So cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hopefully this helps.
I think it does help.
Okay.
I'll see you across the hall.
I'll see you across the hall.
All right. I hope you found that to be helpful. I certainly had a good time recording that conversation with Dr. Mehta. We had fun together. Hopefully you heard some good advice there from our perspective. And as promised, I want to share with you feedback and pro tips from current medical students. I put a call out to our current M1 students who were just in your shoes a year ago, and they were preparing for virtual interviews, and they probably weren't getting these kinds of tips and advice because this was all brand new to them, and it was new to us. So I said, hey, M1s, I'm doing a podcast episode on tips and advice for virtual interviews. What do you have? Send me your do's and don'ts, things you know now you wish you would have known then. Any advice for prospective students that are going to be interviewing this year? And boy, did I hear from them. So I compiled their responses and I did it in sections. And so I edited them a little bit just for purposes of this conversation. But so let's start with your setup. What should your room setup be like and preparing for that? So students said, do the interview, if possible, in a quiet, well-lit space. We talked about that a little bit, Dr. Mehta. Don't do the interview in a place where you could be interrupted by family members or roommates. One of my students said she lived on a very busy street and a ton of traffic noise could be heard from everywhere in her apartment. So she actually elected to do her interviews at a different location where she knew it would be relatively quiet. So as Dr. Mehta and I mentioned, we saw students that were in conference rooms or like interview rooms at a career center that they had signed out for the day. So consider something like that. A number of medical students said, get a cheap light ring. It could go a long way. The lighting can make all the difference in making a laptop camera look more professional. So I think you know the places you can go to look for a light ring. Some cheap ones are on Amazon. So keep that in mind. If your space does appear to be a little bit darker, getting a light ring, and I got one last year because in my area of my house when I was at home doing these, it was a little bit darker and the light ring really made a difference. This is a good one. One student said she ended up switching from a swivel computer chair to an immobile chair, like a traditional chair with four legs, because she felt like she was moving around too much during her interview, like swinging back and forth. So that was something that I hadn't thought of. And finally, some students said they invested in a laptop stand, or they were stacking books up and set their laptop on the stack of books so that the camera on the laptop was at eye level. So there's a good tip right there. You want that camera at eye level. Okay, so when it comes to backgrounds, there are a variety of suggestions on this. One student said he used a pretty cheap photography backdrop so that the background behind him was more uniform throughout the day. Similarly, a student said she sat against a blank wall so that her interviewers wouldn't be distracted by any decor that was around her. And someone else said that they actually backed their chair up slightly to make their eye movements less obvious. So they backed up a little bit away from the camera. This allowed him to switch between looking at the camera and the interviewer on the screen more easily. So something else to think about. But on the other hand, one of my students said that he set up a couple things in the background kind of on purpose because to become topics of discussion potentially. Like one time he set a guitar up in the background and that generated some discussion. I can attest to that. I had my guitar set up behind me. It wasn't really on purpose, just was where it was set up in my room because I would play it sometimes. And so I had people ask me about my guitar in the background. So that can come up as well. But I will also say this same student, this is funny. I remember on his interview day, he had a poster of Mr. Rogers on the wall over his right shoulder, and it totally cracked me up. I didn't interview him, but we could see him when everybody came in and to the Zoom conference room. And when he sent me his tips, I said, David, I remember you had Mr. Rogers on your wall, and he was like, you remember that? I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah. So stuff like that can come up. That really was funny. All right. Switching now to Zoom tips. So here are tips for the virtual, kind of space itself. All right. One valuable interview tip that I heard from our students was to adjust the window size of Zoom to be right under the camera. This way, you never have to worry about making quote unquote eye contact because the screen was just below the camera. I also heard a good tip from multiple students to turn off the self view on Zoom so that you focus directly on your interviewer and you're not distracted by seeing yourself on the screen. So I don't like seeing myself on the screen, and I actually didn't know that you could turn that off. So this was new to me too. So I really like that one. In fact, I think I'm going to try that this year when I'm interviewing candidates to turn my self view off so I can focus directly on the applicant and not look at myself while I'm talking because I don't like that. Okay. Oh, and one more. One student said that he even used a physical sticky note, like a Post-it note, and he stuck it behind his camera, telling him to smile. And he drew a funny face on it so that he would actually smile. So that's pretty funny. Hey, mate, whatever it takes, right? You're doing whatever it takes. All right. Next section is practicing and preparing for your interviews. Practicing and preparing for your interviews. I heard this one a lot. Practice with a friend or family member over Zoom as if you're actually taking the interview. Dress up, wear your interview clothes, be in the location if possible where you plan on doing your interview. Really make it as much of the real thing as possible. And then tell your friend or family member to give you specific feedback related to the quality of your voice and video. So can they hear you well? What does it look like? And you can also, have people, you can record it. And as cringy as it might be to go back and rewatch your recording, I know I find my watching recordings of myself to be uncomfortable, but that's like watching game tape, right? You go back and you see things that you didn't notice before. So you can have your friends, and family ask you questions on Zoom so you can just kind of get a feel for what it's going to be like. One student said that to practice interviewing, she actually carved out time in her schedule so that it forced her to ensure that she had practice time and so that she could prepare for her interview. So she was prepared. Another recommendation was, and this is something that Dr. Mehta and I discussed, as you heard, was don't read off anything during the interview. Like, don't have pieces of paper with paragraphs of information taped on your wall behind your computer screen. It really takes away from the natural flow of your conversation. It could come across as kind of disingenuous or like inorganic, and you might also lose eye contact too. Many, many students said this, that body language and facial expressions are more important than ever on the virtual platform. And this is something Dr. Mehta and I kind of mentioned too, right? You got to be more emotive sometimes on these virtual interviews. So make sure you're comfortable talking over Zoom. One student said that when she was practicing, she often got feedback that it looked like she wasn't making eye contact or that she wasn't looking at the camera, and instead her eyes appeared to be roaming around. She said that she honestly had no clue that she was doing this. But after practicing and getting this feedback, it allowed her to work on this and before her interview, and then she got more comfortable interacting over Zoom. So there you go. That's somebody who saw something and they didn't know they were doing it, watched the recording and came back and was able to self-correct. All that being said, many students said, don't practice though to the point where you have all your answers memorized, right? You should have a general idea of the main points you would like to include for certain questions, but nothing more than that. So again, you want to come across as natural as possible. All right. How about next section is tips for the day of the interview. So don't treat this any more informally as you would as an in-person interview. All right. This is still a very professional interview, even though we're not physically in front of each other. Don't blow this off. If anything, the student said, I think it's harder to connect with a person over Zoom than in person. So it really is important that you take it just as seriously and you're expressing yourself in a way that is conducive to making a connection. Another tip would be to ask the interviewer if they can see and hear you clearly before the interview begins. So maybe you have a quick little introduction and you just kind of quickly say, hey, how am I coming across? Can you hear me okay? Do you see me okay? And that's a good one. Then during the interview, this is good. Listen, wait for the interviewer to complete their thoughts before you start talking. So it's really easy on Zoom if you start to interrupt that the audio cuts out from the other person that's talking. So make sure to kind of balance that, pay attention to when they're finishing their thought or their question before you step into that part of the conversation. And this too. Remember that your interviewers understand that this is strange and it's a new experience, so they're usually accommodating when you experience technical issues. This is to Dr. Mehta's point about the assume good intentions things. Internet instability comes up, and what are you going to do? We're at the mercy of technology. So, like Dr. Mehta and I said, try not to panic. Okay, after the interview, here's some final tips. So one student said some programs, but definitely not CASE, really seem to blend together after the interview day. The student said she always took notes during the interview day and then added into a spreadsheet immediately after the day ended so that she could make sure that she was able to remember information from the day that she could then use in the future for decisions that came around. So write down some things that came up that day, factoids and information that you learned about the school, maybe even the feels. Like, what did you feel like at the end of the day? What were some of those takeaways, those feels from that virtual interview day? And so that you remember that down the road, maybe several months. I liked that one a lot. Lastly, I want to thank all my students like Caroline, Kevin, Christian, David, Megan, John, and Danielle, who really took the time to send me their pro tips and their advice to share with you. And I want to end on a final comment and a piece of really encouraging advice from one of our students who said this. She said, something I know now that I really wish I would have known then is that the interview process can actually be really fun. It is something that obviously has a lot of stress and anxiety associated with it, but if you take some pressure off of yourself and view it as an opportunity to showcase your personality and who you really are, it will not only be so much more enjoyable, but you will also likely have a better interview. So think about that. Take some of the pressure off, be prepared, and if you look back, these interview days might look back and go, that was really fun, and I did a great job today. So I hope all this helps. Good luck, everyone, this year for those having interviews, and see you next time.